it's kind of weird, because one of the things that has struck me this week is that all of these different sort of collaborative things that we've been sort of playing with, the shared vault and the second and the hypothesis annotation, are in a way, kind of ephemeral. And I was sensing, as I was reading, especially the Blair chapter today, that there was this, she spends a lot of time talking about, people sort of turning over their notes at the end of their lives to someone, or selling their notes, or things like that. So I thought that was kind of interesting. The idea that, these things are, are precious and should be retained. So how do you feel about that? Do you have people lined up to give your notes to at the end of your lives?
Well, I've made some efforts in that direction, but I'm not satisfied as to how it may be accomplished. I'm going to speak with a lawyer who is set up to administer a trust. And if through the lawyer, I might be able to pass on some things directly at the time of my death. Because I do feel like I've accumulated quite a lot of useful information.
Yeah. It's kind of weird, because I sort of feel like I will, I'm pretty sure I'm going to, that I will inherit my father's library, but at some point he's 86, so he's got this library, this entire wall. It's got about a 20-foot long wall with, floor to ceiling books, and most of them are annotated. And he was an English teacher when I was a schoolboy, and then he moved on. When I went to college, he moved on and got a PhD at the University of California, and taught comp lit to undergrads mostly, and so he's got a lot of he's read pretty widely, and he's always been a note taker, and he's always sort of written actually with a red ballpoint pen usually, and a ruler. So he very fastidious underlines, and then he has the most beautiful handwriting of anybody I have ever seen. So the nuns that taught him when he was a boy were really apparently effective, and I so I assume I'm going to inherit those at some point. It will be weird though, kind of reading over his shoulder, and I'm not sure let's see. Yes, Hypothesis does work with that, or you can copy you can download the thing to your desktop, and I think actually once enough of us are using it in Hypothesis, we will be able to. Yeah, it's still showing up as a local file for me.
Dan, how do you think sorry, go ahead, Simon.
No, please, after you.
Okay. Dan, how do you expect us to use the group that I joined the group and I saw 15 of your annotations. How do you put the annotations there?
You just go, as you're in a document, you just, as you're annotating, there's a drop-down menu at the top, and you can choose the group, right? So rather than, that's sort of the first step. So on the top right, there's a next to your name, there's a thing that says groups. You choose that group, and then once you annotate, as you're annotating, it will ask you if you want to annotate it to that, if you want the annotation to apply to that group or to be private.
Yeah, but Dan, I guess that is something you have in the browser that you're using in your Mac machine, right?
I'm using Chrome, yeah.
Yeah, whereas the Chrome for Windows does not have that issue. You can't do it that way. So the drop thing that Chris made gets the whole book there in Chrome, and we can do the annotation that hypothesis will pick up, because there's an add-on for Chrome for hypothesis. Is that the same thing you have?
Yes, yeah. So there's an extension, and then there are a couple of little sliders in the extension that allow you. Actually, I think when you use the Chrome extension, what you have to do is there is one slider that you have to actually set that I don't think comes preset. And let me see if I can find that. That is called, oops, where is it? Extensions. Yeah, so if you open the hypothesis extension, oops, it didn't open. Where'd it go? Maybe I got too many things open on my desktop here. That's possible. Okay, so yeah, so if you manage the extension, then there down in there, there's a slider that says allow access to file URLs. And so that has to be on. I don't know if the incognito one has to be on. I usually turn it on just because.
Yeah, I never could get that working with me in Windows. So I use the dog drop one that Chris has.
Okay. Okay, well, whatever works. Hypothesis is, I've used it for several semesters with my students, but it keeps changing. And actually, although I like those guys, and I've talked with Jeremy Dean and the people who sort of are in charge of the educational side of that several times on Zoom. And I've attended some of their I annotate things and that sort of thing. I didn't think it was really that ready for prime time. They were building something that would kind of bolt onto our learning management system, and I think it had more to do, honestly, with them, with their business plan, right? With the idea that, well, this is free to the world, but we also have to run a business here. So what are we going to do? So, but yeah, in any case, going back to the sort of the idea of this. Do we want to talk about Blair first? Do we want to talk about Annie Paul first? Or, I'm sorry, Annie Murphy, Paul. Do we want to kind of jump back and forth?
Well, I find the Blair one more interesting of the two.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I did have some thoughts about the actually kind of bouncing back to our conversation from the Graeber-Wengrow thing, and since then I've actually been listening to an audio version of this recent book by David Reich called "Who We Are and How We Got Here." Hey, Chris. And in it, and basically, I think Reich manages the prehistoric DNA lab at Harvard, is my understanding of who he is, and they have developed some techniques that have allowed them to really explosively increase the number of samples that they can get, and so the genetic records that we have just in the past decade or so have exploded, and that has allowed him to sort of challenge a bunch of things and confirm some things sort of counterintuitively about the ways that people have moved around and mixed and all that, and so it's sort of a history of the last decade or so of that. But one of the things along the way is that he challenges this idea that that Africa was the only place, right, that significant changes in the development that led to modern humans happened, and so he's got some models that suggest that that the people who contributed a lot to the ancestry of Homo sapiens, left Africa, came back. Some of them at least came back. Others didn't. And so so this whole, and the reason that I mention this is that Paul, kind of leans into this in the whole place thing, this Africa savannah evolutionary determinist kind of narrative, right? When she's talking about like Frederick Law Olmsted and Central Park and that sort of thing. So I thought that was, and I don't completely disagree that there's something about the way we're wired that makes us prefer some, landscapes to others, but, I don't know that it's really quite as simple and settled as she sort of lays it out there.
Hey, Patrick, be curious, Patrick, to hear a bit more about what it is about the Blair book that you find more interesting, and is that the Paul book's not at all interesting to you, or is it just in a sort of comparative way?
Well, I find so far what I've read in Paul is rather esoteric. I don't disagree with the idea, but I'm not sure it has a lot of applicability to myself. Whereas Blair is spot right on the idea of note-taking and things that I've spent a lot of time on. So I was particularly interested in the mechanical device that's shown in one of the early figures there in today's portion of how to record notes in history by making them a physical device rather than the fortunate situation we have now with computers where we can just store them away digitally. Although I must say on that topic, I just lost one of my hard drives. And so I'm in the process of trying to restore it, which I'm finding very time consuming and frustrating.
Yeah, that's no fun. So are you talking about the cabinet?
Yes.
Yeah. It was very elaborate.
Right. All to preserve and be able to find some notes.
Yeah.
Somebody else, I don't know if the creators of the cabinet took the notes or other people took the notes or they assembled the notes, but it shows to what extent people valued notes as a way of really a replacement for books, because they couldn't access and read all these books, so they shared notes. And Chris, I think you've got a lot to say about commonplace books on that subject.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so maybe that's a direction to kind of pursue a little bit. Do you think, Pat, that the sort of atomicity of the notes that probably are in these little places is kind of relevant to the pursuit, because it does seem like a commonplace book does have some disadvantages that way about, to being a thing with pages and, something that you would have to kind of go through, almost looking at a scroll. I think Tracy said something about codices in her notes in Obsidian this week.
Well, the fundamental problem is how to access and retrieve the knowledge that's stored in books, in notes, in people's lives who've made notes and so forth. And so that was a device to try to retrieve the information. Today, we've faced a different situation where the amount of knowledge is greatly expanded and it's available to us, but we still have the same fundamental problem of how to locate it and access it and use it. And I'm thinking, well, Google has one of the biggest repositories of knowledge that I can think of right now, other than someplace like the CIA or others that might have even more accumulated in their supercomputers. Mm-hmm. We are not yet at the position where we can use, as far as I know, artificial intelligence to find the information we want that would be most relevant to our current journey or current what we seek. And I would hope that might not be too far distant in the future to apply artificial intelligence to that retrieval problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so this reminds me. Oh, there's Nate again. I was gonna say hello to Nate, and Nate disappeared. Now he's back. Hey, Nate.
Hello.
So yeah, which strikes me a little bit like like the memex and like these things that that early computer scientists were thinking of and were sort of projecting into the future back a half century ago or more. The linking seems to be the other.
I don't know what the answer is, but I look forward to it and I hope I live long enough to see it.
Yeah. The and in the chat says Amazon, Kendra, and the like are trying, not without ethical concerns. Yeah. So I mean, I remember back. I don't know if I was actually a grad student yet when Google started, going to the University of Michigan and scanning every book, and Stanford, and all these other big libraries. And the idea was that all the stuff that was out of copyright was going to be available. And I actually sort of frantically downloaded a lot of books during that period when they were all available, which I'm happy about because they're no longer all equally available. And I still have some copies of of old texts they're useful for my research that are not they're searchable, but they're not even all of them are searchable anymore. So there's sort of that element too, that that these things change over time. So Chris, this does seem to be kind of right in your bailiwick with the talk about the commonplace book and this sort of history that she lays out of how people took notes and why people took notes. I'm personally looking forward more to the turning these notes into encyclopedia. But do you want to kind of tell us what jumped out at you about this?
I don't know. I mean, a couple of swirling thoughts that are interesting. There's one or two spots I found where she either contradicts or contravenes things I've read in other sources. So I've made a few notes about kind of where that has happened. And I'm curious to see if it's just a viewpoint perspective. Although a lot of them are places where translation from Latin in an original source seems to be at the root of the cause, maybe. Mm-hmm. And I'm also finding some of her, and she's jumping around from space to space, which almost everybody in these historical spaces do, because there's so many books and the vast majority of them are in multiple other languages. So it's hard to personally consult them all, or you've got to research them from journal articles and then compile them together. So I'm finding it interesting to see this kind of odd, quirky thread she's drawing through several hundred years worth of space and come up with a coherent thesis of where it is we're going. Yeah. And I have found, and I've even noted one or two spaces where she'll have a paragraph with three dramatically different things, none of which are tied together or related at all. And so I'm kind of wondering what her note-taking process is, because I've seen one or two places I see that, and I'm trying to think of who it was that made someone, I think it was a German, made a comment about the Zettelkasten method, and you can see where one Zettel ends and the next one begins. And were they well tied together enough that that's harder to do that? But there's at least one or two paragraphs where she's got three completely different sentences that I don't know how they made it together, because they have no relation to each other whatsoever. Mm-hmm. Or if they do, she didn't make it apparent to the reader. Yeah. So it's, and it's a tough space. And some of her coverage of, let's say, the cabinet, Marcus Krajewski covers that, I think, a little more coherently, I think. And he's very specifically ties it into kind of a history of note taking and notes building into the idea of what becomes the computer.
Mm-hmm.
So in some sense, and I don't know that he says it explicitly when he talks about it, but when I see that cabinet, it becomes more of a, that's the hard drive of your pending computer, because that's where you're keeping all the little tidbits. And then it's, how do you create a random access memory to run around and pick up the tidbits you need and throw it in? And I'm kind of reminded, in terms of modern setup, and I'm curious who else has had this experience, but when I do a Google search online for, let's say, a specific quote, because I want to know where exactly, too often people quote things and then they won't give the actual source.
Right.
Way too often now, in fact. So I'll find like 20 websites that have that quote, but they usually don't have the original author. They won't have the source or a page number. And quite often they have no other context whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
And it kills me that Google doesn't return to me the book, and here's the book, here's the source, here's the context, as like the first result.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you should be able to like readjust your AI to kind of hone in on that and say, here's the thing and here's some great context around it. But almost invariably it never, ever, ever does that. And I'd say, and then about 50% of the time I end up on Quote Investigator.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody has written an article and here's 50 people who said something similar to that through history. And it grew into something that, eventually became a meme or an aphorism, but, we can't definitively say this quote came from this place.
Yeah.
I find kind of hilarious, but.
Yeah. Yeah. I was kind of wondering, hi, Stan, did you want to throw something in?
No, I was just going to ask, Chris, because he was talking about searching for quotes used, and he talked about AI. Have you tried illicit.org? It's a GPT-3 powered search engine. You could do a standard, Google kind of a search, but you can also use it to refine questions that you're asking, as well as other standard, search kind of things. I first started playing with it just to do the as an example. I run a nightly search for papers for a subject for a class that I teach using Google Scholar. And I ran the same search using illicit.org. And I uncovered topics in the area that I was not aware that existed. And so it really, it really turned me on to some new things, and what I thought was a really powerful tool. So I was, it just piqued my interest. If you were looking for, sources of quotes, I would be really interested, to try to use this tool to see if it could get at the root cause.
That's interesting. That does look interesting. I'm going to play around with that a little bit. Yeah. One of the things that kind of struck me about this chapter of the Blair was when she's talking about, I think she's talking about Francis Bacon, and she kind of and there's a passage where she talks about, and she uses the term adversarial. And then she qualifies as well. It's not really adversarial. It's just the Latin term, but she talks about this kind of note. She sort of alludes to note taking being a discussion with the text, but then she says that, well, what Bacon really preferred was excerpting, right? Which seemed to be sort of two different. Like he's almost like he's got a foot in both worlds, in a kind of an older scholastic, kind of honor the original text sort of world, and then a newer thing that he sort of dipped a toe into and then maybe pulled away from. I was wondering what you guys thought about that. I mean, it seems to me to have something to do with the value of the information versus the value of and the authority of the source of the information, right? And honoring the author kind of thing.
That was that section about the abridgment or forget the word he made. Epitome, I think, was usually one of the classical words they use.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In fact, actually, I think that may have been one of the paragraphs that I saw the seams between the zettles looking out, or right in that section.
Mm-hmm.
Because he also, I think, also right in there was a bit about I think the thing that struck me there more was he seems to be saying what is commonly known as the Feynman technique that Aaron's talked about as well, but I don't think he gave it a name, where you write your note down as a means of kind of summarizing it, but in doing so, it's going to bring out the fact that you don't know or don't understand what's going on when you're trying to explain it to others.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, in fact, that exactly was a thing. I think I wrote a note down. I want to go back and find this original quote by Bacon and check the rest of the context.
Yeah.
To see, is he saying this in the sense of, do this and use this note-taking method as a means of testing your understanding, because the quote or the piece of the quote she used was not big enough to supply that as specific context, but it suggested it certainly.
Mm-hmm.
And the only time I've ever heard anyone talk about this, and Aaron's does it in kind of a nebulous way and doesn't give the thing a name the way I've seen, Farnham Street and 50 other places all use Feynman's name and call it the Feynman technique. But I guarantee it had to have come from some Renaissance setting, if not from before, but I've never heard another name for it.
Mm-hmm.
Or even references to it prior to, the 1900s. And so I'm curious if anybody else has run across that.
Yeah, I do think it's, I'm looking at that, the very kind of hit and miss couple words here or there, quotation of Bacon. So far more profit and use. The latter method would have been nice to get a little bit of context around that. For me, it seems to suggest that there's that sort of ongoing, the conversation that we had during reading the Aaron's thing about paraphrasing, right? And that in that context where where there's a specific, and maybe it's specifically, maybe it's kind of project based, right? Maybe it has to do with, if we're reading, because what he seemed to be doing was, sort of channeling, Luhmann's claim that he never returned to a book kind of thing. Well, I'm very task oriented. I have a question. I go to a text. I get the answer to that question, and then I'm done. Which seems very different from this earlier period where there seemed to be much, much more the idea to me of, faithfully excerpting or, that sort of thing, right? The mine of all arts and sciences, or the habit of excerpting, is just a great title, right? From page 70. I highlighted that. I just thought, yeah, that's kind of cool. But it suggests that that there's something very important, and there's something very almost sacred about the text. I had dinner with some of my colleagues last night, and one of my colleagues is kind of a medieval Roman legal tradition guy. And so I mentioned that we were reading these things. They said, oh yeah, glossing. And he kind of went into a little description of, sort of the way that came out of Spain in the 12th, 13th century, and and Talmudic kind of close reading, and then kind of led into this legal tradition. Certainly puts a lot of emphasis on the sacredness, is the only word I can think of the original text as a text, and not just as a set of ideas that you could work with.
Yeah, I don't think she makes it apparent here, or I don't remember having seen it in the book yet. But there is a kind of a long-standing piece in history and note-taking that goes back to, Aristotle and his contemporaries. And you'll often see, or in these contexts where they're talking about note-taking and excerpting, you'll often see the English words treasure house, storeroom, or storeroom of knowledge. And those, go back to the more classical settings from the commonplace tradition. And it's essentially where we get the word thesaurus. And that was the word they typically used, was thesaurus, which meant a storeroom of knowledge or a treasure house. Was the way it was translated, usually one way or the other. So often you'll see one or the other, and occasionally both, to reference it. That section too, Dan, I actually, and the nice part about having a well-stocked Zettelkasten and an index for these spaces is, when I read that, I'm like, oh, I know I have seen her mention this, or seen a reference like this to Francis Bacon before. Who was it and where is it? And it takes me about 3 seconds with a keyword search for Francis Bacon to pop it up. And it actually turns out the other reference I read about a year back was, she has a 2004 paper that essentially covers the same topic as this chapter. What was the name of it? The name was slightly different. It's called Note-Taking as an Art of Transmission. It was a 2004 paper, and she mentions there this exact same Francis Bacon thing, but with really the context that she adds in both of them were very scant, which, as someone watching it and seeing her make this reference 2 times, roughly the same way in the same place, leads me to believe she read it in another context, but didn't read the original herself, potentially to add even more context to us, the reader of this thing. But she's used the same bit now 2 times in 2 different places, once a paper, so in reading a book about the history of note-taking, while looking at what might have been her own note-taking process, it makes me think about, how do you tease and pull these things apart? How did an author, without having access to her notes, how might she have taken her notes and done it in such a way that she's now got these 2 references to the same thing in 2 separate, disparate places, which she both footnotes. I haven't dug into that next layer yet to look at the footnotes of where she got them.
Right.
Although she makes it a little harder too, and it's in at least a few of her places, she mentions either personal correspondence or discussions with someone on a particular topic, which, is, you're never going to find that as a resource, but
right.
It.
Well, so that is very interesting, because that is, that's the thing that, when we're teaching students how to do this, we say, it's not a high quality primary source if you found it in somebody else's secondary source, right? Which sounds kind of like maybe what has happened here.
But you also, not being interested in a specific area, you don't always have the time to go and dig into all those sources either, or you make no forward progress.
Right.
Although that you bring up the teaching of this, I hadn't seen before references to people mentioning we should keep our note-taking processes totally secret and not tell anyone.
Yes.
Like don't show them how the sausage is made. And it's, someone asked me once that we were talking about how we thought or viewed the world, and let's say if you're looking at the pyramids at Giza, you have no idea how they were made. And from an engineering perspective, once you build an edifice and a structure, and then you remove any scaffolding around it that would have been indicative of how you put the structure up in the first place, it becomes supremely difficult to understand how someone did that. And particularly when building the scaffolding is a huge amount of work in the first place. So if you have a system like the Zettelkasten, without really killing yourself to figure it out, or realizing the work of taking the notes was 4 times the amount of work of the effort of putting out a finished book at the end of the day. And in putting out a book in that method, you erase the majority of the work that took to get you there. And then you just have this magisterial thing at the end that, hope as an author, people are impressed or pleased or find some insight from. But you in doing that, you've erased the entire structure of all the work that actually took you to get there. And it does.
It seems to kind of go back to the conversation that we sort of started at the beginning, which is, what happens to all these notes after we die. And there's something for me about the kind of, in a way, we're sort of, I think we're bouncing around how it is that these things function for us. That is, how do I work with this collection of ideas as notes? And it's a kind of curious thing, because I guess in contrast to what Patrick was saying, my sort of thought, and maybe it's slightly in contrast to what you're saying now, Chris, which is I'm all for their ephemerality, meaning I wouldn't want to burden someone else with them after I die, meaning that they're serving a very particular function now, which is to help me think and to help me write, and to write differently from how I would if I didn't have them. And that actually I understand the purpose of the notes is to serve the writing, if you understand what I mean. And that perhaps how the writing was made is actually not so important. So it's sort of, in a way, rather in a rather banal way, it's a sort of processed product binary, perhaps. So I'm really interested in this, but in part because and of course, this is my kind of bias. This is going straight back to your thoughts at the beginning, Pat. My bias is because of my my expertise is really, I'm curious about something that's helping us think, which is outside the skin of the borders of the body. And so that to me is, I'm kind of fascinated by that thing as a way to help us think, or think differently, perhaps. But anyway, I'm jumping around here. But
he didn't cover it here, but I think Marcus Krajewski does in his book Paper Machines. She mentions Jungius in the 1600s, left a collection of 150,000 notes behind, and he had 3 students who to some extent inherited his notes, I think, and he taught his excerpting method to them, and one of them was Placius, Vincente, or Vicentius, and I think between the 3 of them and several others, they had arguments back and forth about what do you do with these notes. And I think in his case, they literally had, and a lot of these notes were taken on pieces of paper that were commonly called scraps. And you would keep them in piles or sets and then sort through them, because we didn't have index cards yet and we didn't have filing systems. Which I think is the beginning. That cabinet is one of the first filing cabinet setups in history. But his mound of notes essentially became a scrap heap, the proverbial scrap heap of history. He had no system set up to interlink or interrelate one note to another. So there was no index for it, as from what I recall. There was no method of finding, the needle in the haystack. You just had literally a mound of 150,000 excerpts, which means when the person is dead and they have lost the memory and the context, both of where they got the thing and where it's stored in which pile and how to find it, which, if Dan's got a fairly clean office desk there, from what I can see. Some people are not so lucky, but those who have messy desks typically know exactly where that thing they're looking for, which pile it's in, to be able to dig through and get it quickly, or relatively quickly. But in his case, they didn't. So Placius wrote a book, and I don't think she mentions it, but it was one of the early treatises on note-taking and how do you do it in a way that things are then again findable.
Well, and that kind of goes to that bottom of 78, top of 79. I think she's quoting Drexel maybe here. You should have done better to you would have done better to commit them to your mind than to your papers, right? Maybe it's Sacchini. And then
I was going to say, that doesn't sound like Drexel at all.
Yeah, okay, so it's Sacchini.
An anti-memory guy.
Yeah, so it's Sacchini. And but yeah, Drexel. And then she goes on to say that Drexel observed that all of our possessions are subject to loss or destruction, which is not a reason not to have them. But as is memory, right? I mean, the things that we've learned about, aside from these things that Paul was talking about in the other book today, and really touting as fantastically useful. It seems like normal memory is rewritten every time we recall something, right? To some extent. So that's also pretty ephemeral as well. But it does seem like there's a this idea of scaffolding and this idea of sort of, I noted that sort of zero sum advice to keep the secrets of your studies to yourself thing as well. Like, we don't want to let this garage door be open. We want to come out, but that sort of presupposes that there's a different understanding, or there's a particular understanding of the value of knowledge, right? That the knowledge is only in this monument, and that the scaffolding doesn't contain any clues that will be useful to anybody, or that it should be a, maybe, I guess I'm wondering, as I'm saying this out loud, whether this, I mean, we seem to be finding, she seems to be suggesting that there are discussions about this going on in the, in the early modern period, but, in the late modern period, after the advent of sort of professionalized university scholarship in the, the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, does this become more of a thing? That, we want the monument, not, we don't want to see the building blocks. We don't want to see how the sausage is made.
Yeah, when you think about it, it's rather presumptuous to think that our children or others in the future would care about what notes we took and what knowledge we gained, other than leaving a monument, as you say. For example, Dan, will you really find knowledge of value in your father's notes in his books? Or do you value your own seeking of knowledge as more important than what somebody else did?
Well, I think that'll be an interesting experience, because that will be much more about my relationship with my father than my relationship with the texts, I think. And I'll learn more about him than I will about the texts, probably.
That does go to, and I've seen one or two people ask the question in modern contexts, usually on Twitter. People will ask, how do what we consider geniuses now, the Newtons and the Leibnizes, or, almost any thinker through the Renaissance, how are they so smart? And if you put aside the fact that most of them were phenomenally wealthy and, the top 0.01% of their generation, and had the time, effort, and energy to easily do these things, most of them didn't need income of any sort to be able to produce what they were producing.
They didn't have a day job.
If you look at it closely. But almost 2 to 1, they all had some type of note-taking system. The vast majority, at a very minimum, had a commonplace book, most of which were left behind in either their papers, their collected papers, or some library has it. And you can go look, say you can go look at Newton's Waste Book, which I think Oxford has, and dig through it and see how he invented the calculus, because they've got the papers and the books and the notes that showed where the origin came from. But almost 2 to 1, every single one of the people we consider a genius, a writer through the last, especially 500 years, all of them had some system. And that's one of the big commonalities that, you look at them and you say, oh, there's these geniuses. Or, I think about Simon's, and not to embarrass him yet again, his phenomenal dancing skills a few weeks back. Simon is, if I recall, an architect and a designer, and spends all of his time doing something else and not dancing. And that's apparent. But when you go see, you go to the Bolshoi and you see ballet dancers, you're watching people who have spent decades practicing and doing a thing day in and day out. Or you see Olympians who get up and swim 3 times a day, every day. And that's how you win the gold medal. Or I think we mentioned here the quote before, the woman who said, I would give my life to play the violin the way that you do. When you take away all the work and you just see the thing, sure, it will always look like genius. But to me, it's always and I guess maybe it's the engineer in me, it's the pulling it apart. How do you reconstruct what that scaffolding looked like so you can see how was the genius made? And that, for me, that's kind of the fun part about teasing all these things apart and looking into the history, is what does that genius look like? So when I think about Leibniz, I don't think Leibniz, the genius philosopher or mathematician. I think Leibniz in his job title as a librarian. and it's his librarian background that makes him ultimately the genius he became, or that we view him as, not that he was the mathematician or the thing, you know.
Well, yeah, and I think, although I think Simon is a dancer, but I would just make that point.
Not as good a dancer as I could be if I. But yes, I am a professional dancer. It's true.
But to go back to Leibniz, I think, yeah, I thought when she was talking about, reporting on being unable to find things among his mass of unsorted notes, after having done something, I forget it almost entirely within a few months, rather than searching for it amid a chaos of jottings that I do not have the leisure to arrange and mark with headings, I'm obliged to do all the work over again. That seems to me, I mean, I think she took that way too seriously. I don't think I think that's the exception that Leibniz is complaining about in that passage, that actually probably proves the rule of the way he typically is, that when he does have the leisure to arrange and mark the headings, he does so, right? And he has, Chris, the structure that you're actually talking about, right? Where it's not just always a pile of chaotic notes that he can never find anything in.
It's one of those things. And I mentioned it a minute ago, for me, the little bit of serendipity of, I've read something where someone mentions Francis Bacon and note-taking before, and I can do a 2-second search and, yes, here it is. And sadly, in that case, it didn't provide me any more context because it was literally the same author, but it was something. And as I was reading the beginning of this chapter, I'm like, I'm pretty sure Anne has written a paper on this topic before. I should go look it up. Mm-hmm. And I looked it up and I found it, and I totally had forgotten that I had read the paper before.
Yeah.
And then in the middle of the chapter, I found that reference and then looked back and I'm like, yes, in fact, I had read it. It happened on this day, and here are the notes that I took on it.
Yep. Yeah, that's super valuable.
But and so it was okay, but in knowing that now, I have rebuilt a lot of the context way more quickly. Mm-hmm. It's not as if I had to go reread that paper from scratch,
right,
to rebuild the whole context. It all came back almost instantaneously. But it's that, and perhaps Leibniz was being a little facetious in how frequently that happened to him, because most of us have some reasonable memories for things.
Right.
But when you're doing this kind of research at a very base level, once you've read as much as you've read, it becomes harder to know what things have I read versus what have I not read.
Yeah.
And it's nice to be able to go back and look in something like Zotero and say, I marked that thing as read or not.
Mm-hmm.
To know, okay, don't read it again, or don't read it again, but then here are all the notes I took on the thing.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that that there seems to be, but again, that seems to be placing much more value on the ideas, right? Than and maybe I'm just, am I the only one who's kind of stuck on this question of the difference between sort of paraphrasing things into your own note-taking system and because and sort of the memorializing things in in a book of quotes.
I just have the impression that people thought very differently, and I think some of what she's trying to get at as well is how that's changed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that it seems like that that in from the beginning of the chapter to the end, there's a change going on, and there's the beginning of this, especially with the cabinet, right, of this idea that these ideas in these things that we read are sort of kernels that we can take and we can play with and we can rearrange and we can grind up and we can make into our own bread or whatever. And that seems to be kind of a shift which I think is a very, kind of a very positive, because I'm much more comfortable with the second than with the first, than with the sort of, holding up the, the canonical textual quote kind of thing.
There is and one part of the book is about the overflow of information. So it does help to have these, if you've got Bartlett's book of quotations and you need a clever quotation for, the start of a speech, or you're in a debate somewhere and you can pull out one or two apropos quotes, that's great. And then you don't need to have spent the 10 years reading all the classics to have found and had that quote.
Right.
Is fine. But on the other hand, you're missing out on the richness of having done all that work. So we've built these things, we've built encyclopedias, and you can, even as teachers, we say you're writing a paper, in 5th or 6th grade, you can only use 2 encyclopedia articles as references, but then you need to dig further back into the original sources to come up with more thought and ideas and, something richer, go back to the primary sources.
Right.
But in building these, and I literally made a note, because one of the questions that is nagging me in the back of my head as I'm reading all these things, and in both of these books, is we have all these really rich memory traditions that we as a society and a culture have thrown out. And to a great degree, almost no one uses them. A few people still know them and use them in everyday practice, or at least every couple of weeks. Most don't, on the memory side. And on the note-taking side, I think Aaron's book, and, I would go back and put it, the museum exhibition at Marburg in 2013 that created a museum show on, I think it was 7 or 8 different Zettelkasten. I think that is the point at which these ideas kind of came back to life in a museum exhibition. And then a year or 2 after that, Christian creates zettelkasten.de, the website dedicated to that. And a few years after that, Aaron's book comes out, and that kind of becomes the bigger thing.
Right.
So these ideas are catching on now, and I'll jestingly say they were commonplace. But as a society and a culture, we've lost that. And in some sense, we've lost it largely because these methods they were using and what they were using them to build were so successful and useful. The book of quotations, the encyclopedias, the dictionaries, the thesauruses, those became the tools. And then society essentially took that structure down and put it in the closet and made it disappear. A few people still used it, but most didn't, because you could then now try and rely on those encyclopedias and dictionaries and thesauruses and other resources. So we've gone from the base structure to one up, but as an individual relying on that one structure up, you have now got a huge amount of context loss of the structure that was below it. Mm-hmm. So as a society builds up each structure, you still need to remember what the scaffolding and what those things looked like before. As if there were some catastrophic event tomorrow, a huge amount of society would have to rebuild itself entirely, because if you don't have access either to online now or to the physical, copies of the Encyclopedia Britannica, let's say, what are you going to do? How are you going to rebuild it all? Mm-hmm. How are you going to recreate all that thought if you don't have access to all the books and the things that came before?
Yeah, well, or the people, the Fahrenheit 451 people who are the books. Yeah. Simon said something in the chat that I thought was really cool, because about the working process, or the thing that the end product. And I was thinking a lot about this because she was talking about Montaigne, and I was thinking about the essay format, right? because she also mentioned blogs, right? And so there's this, what is it that we're focusing on? Are we focusing on the data, or are we focusing on the performance of a statement, or or a post, or an essay, or an article, or a book? And they're meaningful and they're valuable in different ways, right? Simon, do you want to elaborate on it?
Yeah, just all I'm just thinking about is I'm trying to sort of tie that into what Chris has just been talking about as well. And I guess what comes to mind is, I'm working with a lot of PhD students, and they're mostly in the art, or they're not mostly, they're all in the arts and humanities, and they're dealing with each of them in different ways is dealing with you might say tertiary sources, like they're not even, they're sort of, the encyclopedias aren't a thing in that sense, perhaps Wikipedia, but but they're also overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed at, like, how much do I need to read in order to get to know enough to be able to say something about that thing, which is only tangentially linked to this particular kind of field of expertise, you might say. And I'm assuming that's partly why we're having, or that's why Blair's book exists in a way. And so this I don't know, I get caught between the pleasure of the primary and the 10 years, as you say, Chris, of being in that world, and of going deep into that, but then also the recognition that it feels like it's a rabbit hole, or opening a door which is a long way away from the room that I should be in, you might say, in terms of my expertise and in terms of my discipline and field. And so this is, and I think this is a profoundly difficult, it's certainly difficult for PhD students, because you can just see it in their eyes, like they're kind of like, fuck. Which is, I'm scooted off, showing your working processes. Yeah.
Well, I think that is it's an important thing, because I think a lot of professors, and many who may have grown up with a note-taking practice or some other system that, I know there are others, they don't model, or they don't talk to their students about what that structure looks like. So you've grown up your whole life looking and seeing lecturers. It's becoming a slightly less common now with flipped classrooms, but you see the sage on the stage spouting forth, and you think, oh, these things happen the same way you would watch, it's a little, or for me, growing up, I see a dancer on the stage and they're a great dancer, but it's obvious that they're practicing regularly to have gotten there. But you see a professor get up and give a lecture, and you don't see the hours and hours they spent researching and reading, and I've known several people who have phenomenally good natural memories, and that in combination with a lifetime of reading for 5+ hours a day, you're going to have and interconnecting it and actually learning it and living it, you're going to have a really good grasp of one or more areas. But even now, I think probably one of the better examples I can think of, in the early 1900s, David Hilbert had a lecture, and he made a list of outstanding mathematical problems, that many of which are still unsolved now, a century and change later. But he is well known to have been one of the last mathematicians to know and understand the entirety of the body of math that was extant in his lifetime. And almost no mathematician even close since then. There's now so much math knowledge. As a mathematician, you can't possibly know it all, because it's just physically, you don't have the time and effort and understanding to be able to do that. And so we're literally 115 plus years. Don't check my math. Beyond that. So, how do you take these things and make them apparent to students? Because I think every day I read PhD students who are just overwhelmed and overburdened, much less issues of do I have income? Where am I going in life? How do I deal with the pandemic? Just the pressure of just the PhD student part by itself is so much, and all the rest is crushing on top of it. But over their lives, we haven't modeled for them how to get to that point to be a successful PhD student. Academia has totally failed them in that sense. And so you'll see that, I've probably seen 5 or 6 YouTube channels now totally dedicated to, here's how I take notes in my PhD program and process, so that as a student who is watching me, you can figure it out for yourself too.
Yeah, that's how Ali Abdaal made his name, right?
That scares me to death that we haven't. And I think of it too, because in 1986, I was in 6th grade and first started writing my first paper. And of course, my teacher said, here's some note cards, go take notes as you read. But that was it. That was the practice.
I do feel like I really, really like this book. I think Ambler, I think it's amazing. I love it. And I just think that one of the things about this chapter is it's the same old again. She even talks about, who is the people going out and being instructors. So it's there's always been that meta level of interest. That's the thing. I'm sold on the argument that this isn't a new problem.
Yeah. So that sounded. I accidentally sent a direct message to Pat. It sounded like, Anne, you were saying, I like this chapter, but.
Oh no, I love this chapter. I can't comment on her use of sources. I'm not a historian, but we spoke about this a lot during Dawn of Everything Book Club, and we had that page about how to identify good sources if you're not a historian, and this is just recommended by lots of people who do history of the book stuff and intellectual history. So the whole thing's super interesting. And I feel to maybe take it back to the embodied cognition stuff, I just really can't emphasize enough how much Newton had all of his needs met that were not him sitting and writing. And Oxford and Cambridge colleges still exist to do that exact thing. They're still doing it. You go and you get housed and you get fed.
Yeah.
And then you have the time, and then also you have interactions with all of these other people. So
yeah. So that's certainly conducive. Pat threw something through that quote in the chat about forgetting and AI or other tools, or the ways that we're already cybernetically enhanced, maybe that's the quote unquote second brain argument, right? That this is going to enable us to have more to work with. Is that?
I guess I'm trying to say is that I'm not sure I need more.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Do we need more?
It's really important to be able to forget certain things.
Yeah. I think I wonder about the elements. When I was a grad student, I actually wrote a little book. I wrote a little review of every book that I read in my field reading, and I posted them. I had a website at the time, and I posted them, and I had one of those little little maps of where, where views would come from. And that page got insane traffic, globally. And it's sort of like, I was just like a grad student, putting my personal reaction to these things up on the web. So it did seem like, maybe that was just a lot of people taking the shortcut of, having been assigned that book and not wanting to read it. So they'd use my thoughts in their report. But yeah, it does seem like there's a need to practice, right?
I've got a good example too that just happened in the last year, and I read it as an article in the Yale student newspaper. There was a professor who essentially turned in like 80% of one of her large classes to, their academic senate for, a setup. And she gave an open book, open notes test to her students after having said several times on small quizzes throughout the semester, and then very specifically in bold letters on the test, use anything you want, do not, bold letters, do not copy and paste from the book, from resources, anywhere. Put it in your own words. And, so it's a big thing, because, and she used, the article doesn't bash on Turnitin the way most do, but she ran all the responses through Turnitin to find the examples of plagiarism and then turned it in. And she only reported it out because she had been very explicit throughout the semester. Write it in your own words.
Yeah.
And to some extent, having read Aaron's and some of these other sources, the writing it in your own words will reveal the gaps in what you know. And the repetition of reading it and then writing it and having a modality change of reading it and then writing it, or even saying it out loud, changing the modality will help you learn it in addition to the repetition. So even on this open notes test at Yale, by allowing them to write it in their own words, she's pushing, and I don't think she specifically knows that this is a technique or that she's specifically doing. It didn't say in the thing. And I imagine if I asked her, she would probably not say, oh yes, this is a great method of learning.
This is a retrieval tactic.
A retrieval thing or a production thing. And in the doing that, so even on the test, you're still learning while you're doing it, even if you've never done the reading before or experienced that question before. But in doing that, it's also structured in such a way that if you had the notes and you had used, let's say, Aaron's method and put everything in your own words throughout the semester, and you know where that thing is, when you get to the test, you can pull out your card, your Zettel. Here's the answer. And then you can copy and paste from that. You've done the work. And the test is just giving you an extra repeated repetition of the thing, and then you're done. But even at the highest level of education in the United States at Yale, we haven't done that. So we have totally failed those students. And she did, because there was a chance somewhere along the way to model that behavior. Knowing that here, the exam's coming and this is what it's going to look like. And almost in every day on the first day of class, that's the only thing the student cares about. What's on the syllabus and what are the tests going to look like? How am I going to be graded? And that sad part is that we care more about the how am I going to be graded rather than how can I do the work to get something out of this class for me? Center that first. And the grade is something else. And
you have to, right. And those two things have to go hand in hand, right? And that's one of the things that they do talk about in retrieval practice a lot, is that, these assessments have to be low stakes or even no stakes in order for people to kind of feel that they can participate in that way, right? But Pat in the chat is saying, is it even possible to be original? And that actually, I think, is really kind of central in this education question, right? Because I've had students ask me that a lot. what is this, how am I, what is plagiarism? What is it, what does it look like if I'm, taking these ideas from people and then not, and they're not mine, right? It's like, well, okay, did you figure out how to make fire? It's like we're all, there isn't that much originality in life, but there is thought, right? So I think that we I think that Aaron's is right. I mean, I criticize him a lot for for sort of the ranting and the setting up of straw men, sometimes. But I think in that case, he, when he's sort of complaining about higher ed, I think he does make some relevant points about about how to do that. But I think that they need. I mean, I even had somebody on a YouTube video that I made. Somebody basically said, "This is plagiarism." When I was talking about kind of paraphrasing from making notes and all of that, and and I think that a conversation needs to be had about that. And partially it comes there's a whole context of sort of copyright and and that whole copy, and the sort of the whole history of copyright and Creative Commons is maybe an interesting way to to maybe explore some of that, because our ideas about that have certainly changed over time.
The question you raise about low stakes interests me a lot, Dan, because the discussion reminded me of a case we had a few years ago with a doctoral dissertation that was submitted. And I've been particularly anal that if a student is going to actually quote verbatim a primary source, that it be in quotes and that it be cited. Well, I had this one poor fellow who had page after page after page after page of what was really primary source and no original thought of his own. And so when it came right down to it, the dissertation was not an original work, right? But that was high stakes.
Yeah.
And so what are so you made me think, like, what are low stakes activities or low stakes low stakes hoops I can have them jump through before getting to this point, so I don't say, sorry, you've got this 200-page massive quote that you have to go put, now synthesize and put in your own words.
I think that's the magic word, right? Is synthesis.
Yeah.
To what extent, Stan, are we, I mean, in a way, the kind of emphasis on, I'll say information, like the kind of quantities of information we're talking about, I'll use the word ingesting here, or the capacity to ingest so much information. It seems like there's a kind of trap there, or you might say a technological trap, or one that technology affords or makes possible, which is very different from the kind of the slowness and the time it takes to be thinking and working with ideas. So there's that kind of, I can imagine as a 20-year-old or as a 19, 20, 21-year-old that how steep or how easy it would be to fall into that. that sense of ingesting information as being study or research or.
Mhm.
Yes,
Yeah,
you're right, Simon. Yeah.
and it's probably even more, maybe it's not more difficult, but it strikes me maybe that it's more difficult in places where, or maybe it's easier in a way, in places where the thing that you're responding to is subjective, right? And does is art or is humanities, right? And is interpretive, right? And so maybe at the front end that creates a little bit more. It's a bigger lift, but maybe that is maybe that's the training, right? Where everything isn't expected to line up exactly and there to be a right answer. And I don't know, maybe because that was what I was thinking actually when you were talking earlier, Simon, about or when you said something and I interpreted it as performance, right? That these artistic and cultural and literary performances, right, are oftentimes greater than the sum of their parts, right? So it's not just a question of lining up a bunch of these little, zettles, right, and then pressing the print button, the way you can do in Scrivener. I never use that function in Scrivener.
I don't think it's any, I don't think it's so different from, if I think about the dawn of everything, and that each of us, because each of us is bringing, I'll call it baggage, but let's just say history to how it is that we're reading this particular book. And so it's not that we might disagree on what they said, but how it's important to each of us is incredibly different. And so I think certainly in my field in arts and humanities, I think it, in a way, there's a kind of effort to try and establish the grounds on which someone is standing before they start looking at something. This is my position, right? But I think the mess and mangle of information, if I just think about cultural theory, if you can imagine if you're coming at that from a position of a PhD student, because you're dealing with across field, a different kind of epistemic positions, different kinds of assumptions about what even something, what counts as something being known. And I think it actually, in a way, it makes it messier and terrible for them. I really do. I mean, it's also a pleasure, but yeah, it's not easier. Definitely not easier. And I'm comparing that slightly because I come from a background in science. So I've had both, you might say I've sat at both tables, if that's a way to put it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, Pat, in the notes, you're saying that you putting things in your own words, you lose the source, which I think is maybe also kind of what struck me about this transition, this historical transition. Maybe I was looking at this chapter, too much as a historian, between, this sort of early, this medieval to early modern Renaissance, kind of idea of capturing and collecting these pearls, right? And then a more, and maybe I'm just sort of reading my own understanding of, kind of what's going on in that moment with empiricism and science and that sort of thing as well. But the value that we put on these different things is, I mean, there's the idea, and then there's the source. I think they're different things, and they're valuable in different ways.
I'll give you another example too. I sat on a webinar on Friday around hypothesis, and the theme essentially was teachers who were using it in massive lecture classes of 100 people or more, and how do you do that, and what is it? And most of what I see in those spaces and how they're pushing the use of the tool as a thing as social annotation So it's almost like, how can you take, instead of tweeting about a thing, how can you can, instead of putting your tweet there, tie your tweet directly to the context and have a conversation there.
Yeah.
But most of that academic framing that I've seen in that space is, how do you use this as a tool in a social space? And it's mostly geared at, let's get the students to actually read the material at all. Like, you know, you're going to assign 10 journal articles and a couple of books over a semester, and every teacher knows you'll have one student that maybe reads it all, and the majority of them will dip in a little bit to the book, and they're going to read maybe 2 of the 10 papers if you're lucky. So they're using it as a tool to say, here, and by annotating it, at least you're getting some indication they've spent a little bit of time trying to read at least one of the things. Yes. Instead of having the model of, here's how you can annotate it for yourself and reframe the question, ask other questions, use those questions to go do other research and look around and explore the space and figure out, you know, I almost think students should be forced at the beginning. You're taking a course usually because you need the course to graduate or for some other thing, but I'm giving you the syllabus. I want you to give me a 2-sentence, what do you want to get out of this course for yourself beyond the grade and the thing? And then focus your time in the course on getting that, at least that thing done. And then pull those responses back at the end of the semester and see how many students actually did that. But I'd rather look at that as a practice and a space to say, here's how we can start modeling that type of note-taking to create some bigger edifice 3 years down the line, or, you know, at the end of the semester, you're going to have to write a paper. And at least if you've read the 10 journal articles and the book, you've got at least to start with excerpts you can pull from that, and 1 or 2 questions, some interesting ideas, and maybe one other source you found. And then you can write that paper, and the paper will show up because you've done the work through the semester. But almost no teacher I know in any space, besides Sanka Ahrens himself, is doing that. But at his level, he doesn't have time to spend to say, hey, read this book before you take my course. And it becomes a whole nother thing. But I guarantee nobody on this call, and because we all know it already, even less so, but no student wants to take a class called study skills. And that's what this boils down to. So
yeah, well, I think we definitely gotta make it sexy again. But but I do, I am not a fan.
Again? What's that?
Again, yes, again, we got to make it sexy again. We're bringing note taking back. But yeah, and I'm not actually, Chris, a huge fan of annotating syllabi, and I know that Jeremy and some of those guys are like totally into that. But I do, when I use hypothesis in my class, I do require the students. Thanks. We recorded that for posterity. So what I do is I tell them they have to make, I'll assign a monograph chapter or an article or something, and I'll say you've got to, or actually, because I made my OER accessible on Pressbooks, right? They can annotate that as well. So in the survey course, they have to do that, and they have to make a certain number of actual notes themselves, and then they have to respond to another certain number of things that their classmates have said, and so that does. I think that does get. I mean, it actually gets them. I mean, and you can see, it's very obvious, not only to, and we do this, of course, inside of a private group, so that they're not putting things out on the public web that are going to be out there forever. But it becomes obvious not only to me, but also to the rest of their peers, whether they read to the end or whether they made all 4 of their notes on page 1. So I think that helps. I think that does, and they're not allowed to say, yeah, good point, when they're responding to somebody else.
Yeah, that becomes the reason why if you're writing The Dawn of Everything, you need to have the sum result in the first chapter, because nobody's going to get to chapter 10, 11, and 12. The same way if you look at MOOC statistics online or OpenCourseWare, where videos are posted on YouTube, let's say quantum mechanics is a good example. Go find a quantum mechanics course on YouTube, and the number of views of video number 1 will be in the millions.
Yeah.
And the number of views of video 24
would be in the teens.
Closer to maybe a couple hundred.
Yeah. I think it's well, and that actually that was sort of the last thing that I was thinking, and it was Montaigne that sort of reminded me of that, is sort of, the scope of output, right? What is an appropriate, size, for a performance, for a communication of, knowledge or insight or whatever. I do still stand up in front of the class and lecture. But when I make videos of the lectures, I am thinking about ways to make them sexier. And I don't think that entirely involves just doing this content that, just following the market and doing the content that they want, right? What is Tim wandering the stacks and pulling the yes. Research Rabbit is kind of sexy. I mean, just the way that it finds things,
and so is the Clapton bus, of course.
Yeah. So so it looks like we've used our time. So next week we will be kind of substantially finishing the Paul book, and then reading the meta chapter in Blair. It seems to be, at least to me, to be a meta chapter. But I am interested in this Blair, question of, the encyclopedia. So any last thoughts?
Just to say, it's interesting in the way that it seems like, and I don't share this, but it seems like we're steering more towards Blair's writing, and I'm curious about the kind of synoptic, is that the right word? What is it? The two, reading books at the same time, and I wonder if there's any kind of work or any kind of value in trying to do that more. That there's maybe and I'm not. It's not because I'm not trying to push anything on anyone, but yeah, I'm curious about that.
I'll look into that a little bit. Maybe I'll connect with Maggie a little bit on that, because I think she did that, very successfully in the Rome group, and see if she has any pointers for me.
Or if we've got more notes popping into Obsidian, we can cross-reference the overlaps of where the two books hit and figure out a way to discuss those commonalities. I haven't done that yet, where I've pulled these two books and seen where the keywords and spaces, except for in some of my notes, the word orality becomes the tie between the memory piece and the knowledge piece. But I think we're all viewing it from a much more literacy and word-based perspective that I may be the only one who's looking at it from that angle.
Possibly, but there were some interesting ideas in this one of I thought in the middle chapter. So yeah, maybe we can return to that. And we don't have to, we can go back to those things, based on what it is that interests us in this coming week too.
Certainly not stressing me out, just to be clear.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, because we did kind of think that we sort of planned to do this and have been focusing quite a bit on Blair. And maybe that has to do with the choice of the two books, as well as as well as my understanding of the process. So, but in any case, so thanks very much, and I'll see you in the vault. I'll be probably trying to spend a little bit more time in there this week, and then see you in a week.
Okay.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan.